Hi everyone, nice that you're joining us this afternoon. We're going to have a fully packed webinar looking at climate change and the circular economy, as well as circularity in the water and energy sector in South Africa. My name is Katerina Giering. I'm with the Circular South Africa. We are part of the African Circular Economy Network and trying to establish the platform in the country. With me, I have Christo, and I have also Mark, our community engagement manager. And obviously, we have an amazing team from the CSIR joining us today. Just for housekeeping rules, please keep your videos off for now. That would be really appreciated. And please keep yourselves muted. The session will be recorded, and we're going to publish the session then on our YouTube channel. And we send a follow-up email so that you have all the information necessary. Then I'm going to just give a few words around the Circular South Africa. So Circular South Africa is the platform around circular economy in the country that we're currently establishing. We have started in January of this year, and we're very much around facilitating the cooperation, coordination, and networking between the quadruple helix in the country and breaking the silos in the circular economy space, because we do need to connect all the different sectors in South Africa to make a circular economy happen. Looking at the agenda, as I said, we have a fully packed session ahead of us. First, Linda will speak to the CSIR circular economy research. Then we will have an excellent presentation on climate change and the circular economy, the energy and the circular economy, and the water and the circular economy. And then finally, we have a Q&A session. And I would ask you to please post your questions during the presentations in the chat. And please also address it to the speakers so that we can pick them up and actually post them to the different speakers. So almost handing over to Professor Linda Godfrey. She is a principal scientist at the CSIR and an extraordinary professor at Northwest University in South Africa and holds a PhD in engineering. She has over 20 years of sector experiences, and she manages the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap Implementation Unit on behalf of the government. She has provided strategic input to a number of local, regional, and international waste and circular economy initiatives for the United Nations, European Union, World Bank, South African Government, Academy of Science, International Solid Waste Management Associations, and businesses. Linda is a true expert in her field, and I think I don't need to say more about her expertise. She will convince you in a heartbeat herself. So Linda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and it's lovely to be partnering with Circular South Africa on this event, so thank you for that. Let me just get my screen up for you. And also thank you for everybody for making the time this afternoon to join us for this exciting webinar. So hopefully you can see my presentation on full screen, and I'm going to jump right in because I've just got a few minutes. I want to leave most of the time for my CSR colleagues who are on the call as well. So first of all, I think just to set the scene as to why we are today, where we've come from, the journey that we've walked, the circular economy is recognized by the South African government in the Department of Science and Innovation's Science and Innovation Decadal Plan as a new growth opportunity for South Africa. And in fact, in the document, they mention that the transition to a circular economy provides a means to implement a just transition for South Africa, unlock socio-economic opportunities, and address the country's international climate commitments and make significant progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the context from where we start. And I think as an entity of the DSI, and given our multi and interdisciplinary capability, we felt that the CSR was very well positioned to both understand and to evidence what a circular economy transition means for South Africa. And in fact, whether it's a relevant concept for South Africa as a developing country. But importantly, as a science council, how science, technology, and innovation can support this transition. And so we initiated a project back in mid-2021, we called it Phase 1, which looked at 7 resource-intensive sectors of the South African economy. It was mining, agriculture, manufacturing, human settlements, mobility, energy, and water. And what came out of that first phase, and many of you, well, hopefully many of you on the webinar this afternoon will have accessed these documents from Phase 1. There were 8 short briefing notes which we published, think pieces. They were each 4 pages long, a very quick read that was intended to really frame what a circular economy means in each of these sectors. That was followed by an open access book on circular economy as development opportunity for South Africa, that again essentially sort of consolidated this thinking around what could a circular economy transition mean for South Africa. And then following those short think pieces, we published the first 3 what we call deep dive technical reports for mining, for agriculture and manufacturing. These were published last year, and they essentially answered these 2 research questions. The first one was, is resource scarcity a driver for South Africa to transition to a circular economy? And the mining report answered that question, and yes, it is. And then secondly, it looked at what are the circular economy opportunities in agriculture and manufacturing in South Africa. And all of these documents are publicly available. I've provided the URL at the bottom where you can access these. And so today, I'm very pleased that the CSR now releases its next 3 technical reports, which is essentially looking at climate, energy, and water. And it answers the next 2 questions, which is building on the first driver question around resource scarcity. It asks the question, is climate mitigation a driver for South Africa to transition to a circular economy? And importantly, what are the circular economy opportunities in these energy and water sectors? And so with that, I'm going to just close my presentation, and I'm going to pass over to my colleagues who will be able to take us through in more detail the answers to those 2 particular questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Exciting to have you guys on board as well. I'm going to hand over the word to Yadashin. He has graduated with a Master's in Science and Environmental Science from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2016. He is currently a candidate researcher in the Climate Services Research Group within the Smart Places unit. He's listed as a nominated South African UNFCCC expert for greenhouse gas mitigation effects, and has been a leading author for the assessment of mitigation actions in South Africa's 3rd to 5th final updates reports. So over to you.
Thank you. Just checking, is my presentation being shown?
I can't see it at the moment. Maybe just unshare again and try to share again.
All right.
Seems that it kind of kicks you out. There we are. And yeah, if you just go into presenter mode, then I think you're ready to go.
Okay. All right. Is it being shown? Just checking again.
Just want to check with my colleague Crystal. Is it also skewed on your side? Maybe it's just my
Yes, it doesn't fit the screen.
Maybe just.
Oh, okay. What do I need to do? Present to view.
Perhaps try the icon at the bottom, the screen, the presentation mode screen.
It's next to the Zoom thing where you can slide the Zoom items. It's to the left-hand side.
Oh, okay. Is it a view or sorry? It's
No, it's okay.
Settings.
Maybe try to share again, and then we can.
Okay. All right. Yeah. See it stopped sharing already. Okay.
And then if you go presenter mode, it's bottom right-hand corner on that little ear show screen.
Is it on the Zoom or is it?
It's on the Zoom, so we can see it, but it's not in presenter mode yet.
Okay. Right. Full screen.
It always happens, right? We did all the technical checks, it works, and now it doesn't work anymore. Yedashin, what we could also do is I'm going to move on with one of the presentations, and you can mail it to Christo in the meantime. And then we
I think
share
I did send it already.
Yes, I can share it on my side if you want. Did I see?
Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect.
Perfect. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Awesome. Thank you, Christo.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. And I'll be covering the climate change and the circular economy side of the project. And this was looking at quantifying the climate change mitigation potential of the circular economy in South Africa. And it's really trying to see whether climate change mitigation or the circular economy itself is a driver for climate change mitigation. All right, the next slide. Okay, the outline of this presentation, we're going to cover the background. Why look at the circular economy through a climate mitigation lens for South Africa? The purpose of the study, the methodology that we use, the results and analysis, the findings and implications, the recommendations from the results and findings and outputs, and some recommendations for future research. All right, the next slide. So why look at the circular economy through a climate mitigation lens? It's because South Africa has already crossed its environmental boundaries for climate change, and it's not on a sustainable development trajectory at the moment. And so the circular economy transition is widely recognized as a drive for sustainable development trajectory. And this includes the opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the United Nations Development Programme has been quite an important organization spearheading, the application of circular economy thinking for how countries communicate their mitigation ambitions in terms of greenhouse gases through their national determined contributions. And then this quotation is from one of their reports where they mention that making our economies more circular is essential, not only to integrating economic, social, and environmental objectives, but also to grasping the potential for substantial and accelerated reductions in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors. All right. But there is little understanding at the moment, at the present, on the potential to enhance South Africa's mitigation efforts through a circular economy approach. The next slide. And when we're looking at other literature references, the World Resources Institute further states that the circular economy strategies can complement decarbonization measures to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions from material production, help lower emissions from operational energy use in the built environment and transport, and cut emissions from waste management. And according to the World Resources Institute, the built environment, transport, food systems, and clean energy are the most relevant sectors for circular economy strategies to deliver climate change mitigation benefits. So understanding how the strategies to reduce emissions directly linked to the way materials are extracted, produced, and consumed allow countries such as Gambia, Laos, Kazakhstan, India, China, Vanuatu to broaden their climate change pledges. The next slide. All right. Then going further on the international context, one of the key leaders on circular economy research was the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and this particular study in 2016 on the circular economy in India, it showed that the adoption of circular economy interventions in 3 focus areas were key to the economic society, being cities and construction, food and agriculture, mobility and vehicle manufacturing, and that these could significantly mitigate negative environmental externalities. And in that particular study, they found that the biggest potential for greenhouse gas emissions reduction was in mobility and vehicle manufacturing, with a potential 68% reduction in 2050. Another Ellen MacArthur Foundation study, and this was for China, showed that applying circular economy principles across 5 high-impact areas comprised of 3 urban systems, the built environment, mobility, and nutrition, and 2 industrial systems, the manufacturing, textiles, and electronics, reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases of 11% by 2030, 23% by 2040 could be achieved. And also similar to the India study, the largest mitigation potential was identified in mobility. Okay, and next slide. And then the Hoosgaard study, that one was a more global study. It proposed key circular economy interventions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in low and middle income countries, and identified 2 key sectors: your food and agriculture, that being shifting to healthy diets, regenerative crop production and agroforestry, and manufacturing, eco-innovation in industrial clusters and networks. And in the table that's below the text, the interventions at a global level, regenerative crop production, agroforestry, by the max mitigation potential from 2020 to 2050, and I assume this is cumulative, in billion tons of CO2, it's 161, and then that's followed by eco-innovation in industrial clusters at 108 billion tons of CO2 equivalents, and shifting to healthy diets, regenerative crop production, agroforestry has 166, with the highest mitigation in terms of maximum potential of all. All right, next slide. So the purpose of the study, given the international findings that I've just talked about on the opportunity for a circular economy to provide in reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, and also helping to strengthen South Africa's climate commitments, the aim of the study is to answer this question: whether transitioning South Africa to a more circular economy can help reduce its national greenhouse gas emissions and assist in achieving national policy objectives of a net zero carbon economy by 2050. So the study therefore aims to evaluate the climate mitigation potential of circular economy interventions within various resource-intensive sectors of the economy. I'll list those sectors shortly. And this question is answered for South Africa through the following approach. We related mitigation measures to circular economy principles in each of the 7 selected resource-intensive economic sectors with significant potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we apply existing methods for modeling greenhouse gas emissions, and this will help quantify the circular economy potential of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The report reviews opportunities within and across economic sectors to enhance mitigation through the circular economy in South Africa, and through selected case studies evaluates the benefits of circular approaches to mitigation. Right, the next slide. So the methodology applied was a 2-pronged approach to quantifying the mitigation potential of circular economy transition for South Africa. The resource-intensive economic sectors included in the study were energy, manufacturing, mining, mobility, agriculture, human settlements, and water. The first step involved a review of existing published literature to identify activities with the largest contribution to South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions and the relation between emission sources and circular economy sectors. So we looked at the review of the local and international circular economy interventions, which I've just covered in terms of the international context, and then the linkages of the most disruptive interventions to implement planned and proposed climate change mitigation technologies and their greenhouse gas emission reduction effects for designing out waste and pollution. These are the principles around circular economy, keeping products and materials in use and regenerating natural systems. And then this was followed by a modeling exercise to quantify the climate change mitigation potential of circular economy measures in South Africa. The next slide. So this slide covers, the how we conceived the relation between the emission sources that is reported in South Africa's national greenhouse gas inventory and the circular economy sectors. And what we find is that for the category in energy industries, that includes electricity generation, petroleum refining, manufacture of solid fuels, and your other energy industries, that is more related to your energy sector. That also includes the other emissions from energy production, and that is related to the manufacture of synthetic fuel production, such as your coal to liquids and your gas to liquid fuels. And then under non-specified, that's charcoal production, all right? Under manufacturing and mining, so we clustered those two together because within South Africa's greenhouse gas inventory, manufacturing and mining and construction are actually bundled together when it's reported for its greenhouse gas emissions for fuel combustion related emissions. And then, of course, the only one that's separate from distinctive for mining is the fugitive emissions from coal mining and handling. But those are the methane emissions that leak from your coal mines mostly. All right. Under your human settlements, that covers more your fuel combustion or the fuel use within residential and commercial and institutional sectors. And then the other arm of that's reported as part of other sectors, agriculture fuel combustion, that's reported within the agriculture sector. And all the other components of the agriculture sector includes your cropland carbon stock, your biomass burning in cropland, and your agricultural soils, and the management of the soils within what they call in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the AFLU sector, the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses sector. So that's all clustered in terms of under agriculture, but that excludes in terms of how South Africa is currently conceived the circular economy agriculture sector, the livestock emissions, for example, that actually is a big part of your AFLU sector emissions. All right. And then the last one is waste, and under waste that's related to the water sector, that's wastewater treatment. Now, a lot of the times when you Google what is the circular economy about, it mentions waste, and what we find is that waste is cross-cutting across all of your different sectors, but the way it is quantified within greenhouse gas emission inventories is it's a collective or a bundled methodology which looks at the emissions coming from your landfill sites, looks at the emissions under your open burning, as well as your composting and incineration. So because there are various waste streams going into your landfill sites coming from your commercial businesses, coming from industries, coming from agriculture, coming from your households, it's difficult to differentiate between the different sectors and their sectoral contribution in terms of their waste streams, but also the different types of landfill sites that are currently being run in South Africa. They currently don't really have a good understanding how the various emissions are coming out from different types of landfill sites, especially your private versus your municipal landfill sites, or those that are receiving mainly, for example, industrial waste or your agricultural waste. Okay, the next slide. So the next set of slides will cover briefly this slide covers sector-wide greenhouse gas emissions, and then under each of these different sectors, I will cover the what we used as the base business as usual scenario, which is a projection of the historical emissions based on your South Africa's greenhouse gas inventory. We've used 2019 in terms of how we modeled the emissions here as a starting year, and then we fast forward to 2050. So in terms of the backcasting of what, how the time series of emissions that we, historical emissions, it's from 2000 to 2019. That's how we can see the trends have changed in terms of the different sectors. And we find that in terms of your sector-wide greenhouse gas emissions, when we relate these greenhouse gas emission sectors to and align them with the circular economy sectors, we find that energy contributes the most to your greenhouse gas emissions. That's about 299 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's followed by your manufacturing, mining, and construction at about 64 million tons CO2 equivalent, and then mobility, agriculture, and then the human settlements and water contribute the least to that total of about 481 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. But then when we look at the percentages in terms of their contribution, energy sector, that again is the largest at 62%. So you'll see that from the rest of the slides that there's a big focus on the fuel combustion and throughout in each of the sectors. Then your manufacturing contributes about 13%, followed by mobility at 12%, agriculture at 10%. All right, and then in the smaller sectors, it's 2% and 1%. All right, and then in terms of the sector-wide greenhouse gas emissions and historical ones, the emissions have actually increased. So I just included some of the years where it peaked. That's in 2007 and 2012. And we find that the emissions actually, they increased up till 2007, and then between 2007 and 2012, there's this decrease. And then after 2012, there's this further decrease. And most of that is attributed to the load shedding issue, but we don't really understand the implications, the full implications of the load shedding issues on why it's created this downward trajectory in the last few years. But of course, renewables, especially in the last few years since the IPP projects have come online, has certainly contributed a lot to reducing emissions. But of course, between 2007 and 2012, when those were still relatively new, a new concept, that was mainly driven by load shedding. So, all right, the next slide. I'm just checking on time. How's my time?
We are already running a little bit behind, so I've seen you do have quite a few slides left.
I'll try and go through them as quickly as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Energy sector. So energy sector, we looked at the emissions in electricity generation, as well as the emissions in synthetic fuel production. And we couldn't look at some of the other sectors, such as petroleum refining, because that's a minor source manufacturer of solid fuels, that we didn't have the activity data for that particular sector. The fugitive emissions from oil storage and charcoal production goes a relatively smaller sector, so we didn't look at that one. But what we find, the next slide, please, that in terms of energy, you can click through this so that the full slide shows, sorry. All right, oh, there we are, okay. So in terms of electricity generation, the total greenhouse gas emissions reduced in 2050 amount to about 43 million tons of carbon CO2 equivalent from a combination of measures related to designing out waste and pollution. And this is more about reduction of the coal and gas electricity generation capacity in the region and the regeneration of natural systems, the increase in the share of the electricity generation from renewable energy sources, and zero emission fuel alternatives to synthetic fuels. All right, next slide. Then the second one we looked at in the energy sector was synthetic fuels production, and the total greenhouse gas emissions reduced in 2050 amount to about 33 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from a combination of mitigation measures related to designing out waste and pollution. That's the reduction of coal use in synthetic fuel production, and the regeneration of natural systems, a shift to alternative fuels in mobility. And then that's driven mainly by the shift to alternative fuel sources and mobility. All right, next slide. Then when we look at the total circular economy mitigation potential in the energy sector, again, the total greenhouse gas emissions reduced in 2050 amount to about 76 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent from a combination of mitigation measures related to designing out waste and pollution. That's the reduction of coal and gas electricity generation capacity, as well as the phase out of synthetic fuels production, and the regeneration of natural systems. That's the increase in the share of electricity generation from renewable energy sources and zero emission fuel alternatives to synthetic fuels. So while the business as usual scenario already includes some circular interventions for the energy sector, that's the renewables, we adopting a more ambitious regenerative energy practices, it creates an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emission levels to well below 2019 levels by 2050. Next slide. So in terms of your greenhouse gas emissions in manufacturing, mining, and construction, we find the most of your emissions are coming from your manufacturing, mining, and construction fuel combustion. That's the fossil fuels consumed within that sector. But then when we look at the breakdown of the three, the manufacturing, mining, and construction in the pie chart to the right, we see that construction actually has some very minor contribution compared to mining and industry. So we didn't look at construction given that it's a minor emission source. And then of course, industrial processes and product use, that is a big one as well, 42% of the emissions. But we don't look at that further because we don't really understand all of the emission sources within that sector, especially when it comes from your much smaller industry subsectors, which is actually packaged all under other manufacturing. All right, and then we viewed your coal mine fugitive emissions is at 5%, and that's actually about 4.49. So that's actually very small. So again, we didn't look at that. We just mainly looked at the manufacturing and mining fuel combustion. All right, next slide. So in terms of that, the manufacturing and mining sector and the fuel combustion for that, the total emission greenhouse gas emission reductions reduced in 2050 amount to about 45 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent from a combination of mitigation measures related to designing out waste and pollution regeneration, and these waste and emissions prevention linked to a transition to green energy associated with the fuel switch from fossil fuels in manufacturing and mining. That's related to coal and coking coal to electricity, assuming a net zero energy mix, gas, hydrogen, and biomass. And the business as usual scenario already includes some circular interventions from the NCPC industrial energy efficiency program that amounted to about 0.49 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. All right, next slide. So then the greenhouse gas emissions and mobility, we find that the road transport actually contributes the bulk of the emissions at 93%. So we actually just focused on road transport being that has the most opportunity to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions in that particular subsector within mobility. Next slide. All right, and mitigation measures in the mobility sector, that being road transport, it's a combination of increased use of zero-emission mobility that's related to designing out waste and pollution, and freight mobility systems based on hydrogen, and that's related to the regeneration of natural systems. So the total greenhouse gas emissions reduced in 2050 amount to about 34.58 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. And it shows that adopting circular economy practices in the mobility creates an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emission levels to below 2019 levels by 2050. So besides the hydrogen, we find that the increased use of electric vehicles is actually a big driver behind reducing emissions. All right, the next one. Next slide. All right, and then in terms of agriculture, this gives just a bigger picture of where your agricultural emissions coming from. Most of it is coming from livestock, but again, which I mentioned, it's not really part of the agriculture sector, or circular economy as it's defined. So we just look at the cropland carbon stock change, which is about 5%, your agriculture fuel combustion, which is about 11%, in your cropland biomass burning, which is very small, and that one is about 1%. So we don't actually look at the cropland biomass burning later on. But when we look at the carbon stock change in agriculture, that's from your croplands, and then we look at the fuel combustion in agriculture in terms of the modeling. Okay, the next slide. And then when we looked at the carbon stock change in agriculture, we looked at the case of zero-till. And we find that forests and grasslands store more carbon in the soil and vegetation in relation to agricultural land. So we lose a lot of that carbon through harvesting of crops, the tillage of land, and the burning of felt. So when we implement or use zero tillage, we actually reducing the loss of carbon stored in the agricultural soils. And the assumption we made, and this is based on a DEF report from 2020, it was assumed that the area under zero tillage is 14% of the annual crop area in 2018, and that grows at a rate of 7.5% with a mitigation potential factor of 0.2 tons of carbon per hectare per year. All right,
Yeah,
the next slide. Yes.
Can I just maybe ask you to speak to total circular economy mitigation potential, because I think we can share the slides afterwards around the different sectors.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's great.
That's a good idea.
I just have to apologize that this covered so many sectors.
Absolutely.
It's a pity, but okay, let's cover the total economy potential for all the sectors then. So we find in terms of the agriculture sector that your larger emission reductions is about 11.56 million tons of CO2 that's regenerated in natural systems. That's related to zero tillage practices. The switch from using less diesel to using more electricity and more hydrogen and biomass resources for energy resources in your agriculture sector has an emission reduction of 1.91 million tons of CO2 carbon dioxide equivalent. That increase from 2019 to 2050, that's related to if we didn't actually change the types of energy resources that we use in agriculture, your energy agriculture sector emissions will grow that much, quite significantly, because of your diesel fuel use. All right. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to cover this very quickly, and it's essentially that as we switch over from to cleaner energy sources and use more electricity, we find that the emissions from in the commercial and residential sector actually decrease. And that's related more to the design out waste, but also in combination with regeneration of natural systems. And you can go to the next slide. All right, that amounts to that emission reduction as more households and businesses use less fossil fuels to using more electricity, assuming a net zero energy mix, as well as more the hydrogen and more other cleaner energy sources. It amounts to about 1.1 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. All right, next slide. And then, of course, your greenhouse gas emissions in the water sector. What we modeled here was the capture and utilization of methane emitted from wastewater treatment processes. What we saw in the literature was that the current status quo is that not many wastewater treatment plants are utilizing the fugitive emissions or the methane emissions coming off the wastewater treatment processes for on-site power generation. But if they were to, the next slide, they could be a very substantial. You could almost halve your emissions coming out in 2050 coming out from the wastewater treatment emission source, which is 4 million tons in 2050, and then your emission reductions 2 million tons. So you're left with in your circular economy scenario in 2050 with just a 2 million ton circular economy. And there was a question around, I think, in the question, the number of questions about how mitigation and adaptation work together to help drive reducing emissions. And what you find is that as more and more households and more businesses in your urban areas shift towards using or being part of the centralized sewage network, that emissions actually grow. So to mitigate or reduce the emissions, offset those emissions, we need to look at more circular economy opportunities around sanitation that will help reduce it. Besides the utilization of the methane from the wastewater treatment plants, there, a lot of the conversation we had earlier in the meeting would be in the workshops that we've had in the past for this project, was how sanitation could drive reduce the emission reductions, but as a co-benefit rather than a direct mitigation benefit. And that's more about adaptation within sanitation.
Yeah,
right.
Can I just ask you maybe just to speak to policy opportunities to achieve ambitious circular economy mitigation, which is like 30, because otherwise we're running out of time, and I also want to give the other speakers an opportunity.
All right. So
it is a lot to cover.
Yes. So I've covered most of the sectors, and what we find is that in terms of because 90% of the total emission reductions that we modeled in the study can be attributed to fuel combustion, that if we look at the integrated resource policy of 2019, which is the medium-term outlook until 2030, it's important, especially with integrated energy plan, which is outdated, and next updated IRP, that long-term goals for electricity generation and final consumption related to mitigation, they have to be much more ambitious to achieve this 33% of reduction of fuel combustion emissions. That 33% could even go upwards up to 70, greater than 70%, if you include include your other current emission policy measures. All right, and then in terms of your cropland carbon stock change, is this an example that if you that, you know, we need more detailed mitigation potential assessments to understand the impacts of your various climate smart agricultural practices and technologies. We focused on zero tillage, but there's a whole host of other practices and technologies within agriculture that can substantially reduce emissions within agriculture. And of course, looking at inclusive, that should also include the livestock sector. Okay, and then the wastewater sector. I tried to look through the sanitation policies to see whether there were any clear policy commitments by government to retrofit existing wastewater treatment plants and include or make commitments to include, the capture and utilization of methane for on-site power generation. Use that technology for future wastewater treatment plants, but it's not actually clear that that is the case. So that there needs to be clearly communicated if we want to substantially reduce your emissions from wastewater treatment. All right, and then yes, I think go to the final slide.
Thank you so much. And yes, you're completely right. This is a lot to cover and unpack, and I think it just shows the complexity, right, of what we're trying to cover.
Yes, and I think I covered most of the main messages. So thank you so much, and yes.
Thank you. Perfect. Our next speaker is Aradna. She will speak to the circular economy in the energy sector. Aradna is currently a principal researcher in the energy industry research group of the Energy Center of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. She holds a bachelor's degree in electronic engineering and a master's degree in electrical engineering, renewable energy. She serves as a technical board member of CSIR in South Africa, representing the country in the International C6 Study Committee on Active Distribution Systems and Distributed Energy Resources. She is also registered as a professional engineer with EXA. So over to you, Aradna.
Thank you so much. Can you please confirm that you can see the right screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to try and be quick. I also do have a long presentation, but yeah, I think most of the information is available in the report in much detail in the report. And yeah, you can even reach out to the team if you feel that you need to speak about any of the aspects. So in terms of the energy sector, I think everyone knows that it's a hot sector at the moment, and we're living what we term the energy crisis in the country. And partially or part of the reason is aligned to us not moving towards or transitioning rather towards the technologies that we should have been in the rate that we're supposed to have as part of our plans in terms of our integrated resource plan that Darshan has mentioned as well. But in terms of the kind of the status quo, we have a very coal-dominated electricity mix, and around 80% of our electricity production last year, I think, was coming from coal. And it still is quite dominated in the electricity sector, although we do have a mix of technologies, and we do have other technologies, and there is a need and at least a policy intent to drive the transition towards low carbon electricity and energy technologies. Some of the range or the challenges rather that we are facing in terms of what has actually led us to this point of electricity or energy crisis that we are experiencing, and some of the other aspects that are relating to some of the economic and social aspects and impact in regards to what the country is going through, is related to some of these challenges. And these are quite vast and has, I think, a dynamic effect on the electricity sector. We can't actually say that there's one problem that we are facing that has led to the crisis that we have gotten to. It's quite an ecosystem of challenges and problems that we have created on our own slowly as we have gone in the way we live in the country. And the consequence consequences are therefore felt, and there's a lot of them that have been felt. But I'm not going to go into detail given the time constraints, but you will have the presentation, as I've mentioned, and the report. So in terms of circularity and us looking at what type of nature we have in the electricity or energy sector, we do have a very extractive energy economy. And as I've mentioned, we're mostly dependent on coal. And these are some of the years that have been put out in terms of the reserves that are available in the country for coal, gas, and oil. And you can see that it is finite. And it has been mentioned by Linda as well, and it is a problem, and we know we need to transition. Note that this coal is not only for South Africa, as we also export our coal to other countries, so that makes it even bigger problem. But the country has realized that we do need to transition. They have put in plans for I think from at least 2010, we've been talking about transitioning to low carbon energy technologies. And we saw the birth of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program with regards to that. And we know that the climate change is a big deal, and we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to impact Africa at least twice as much as it will impact other global north countries. So we do definitely need to do something about it. And this has been indicated in our plans and our visions to move. For considerations in the more circular economy, and I think some of these have been mentioned and also spoken about in the report as well. These three kind of top options have been looked at and evaluated in terms of the energy sector and how to actually move towards a more circular economy in the energy sector. And the first one is design out waste and pollution, keeping products and material in use, and regenerative natural systems. And you can read more about that and how we relate it to the energy sector in the report as well. So the objective and methodology of or the approach that we took in the report and the work that we just conducted in terms of the deep dive. So we provided the deep dive in the energy sector, evaluating the current developmental path, and that includes the status quo as well as how we are moving towards the new electricity mix or energy mix that we have put out in terms of the different technologies that we need to start implementing to move towards a more cleaner or low carbon energy sector, and the potential for the circular developmental path and how this actually links to some of the plans that have been put in place. And we've also then identified some business opportunities related to this as well, and that's in the report, and I will touch on it very slightly towards the end. The methodology that we used the collection of primary and secondary data, more aligned to literature review and international approaches and national trends for circular economy interventions. And then we also went through stakeholder engagements and surveys for data collection from relevant stakeholders in the energy sector. So in terms of the current path, I think I've spoken to some of these aspects in the status quo, but there are further data and information in the report and in the presentation speaking to this and highlighting it more, that we are a very coal dependent, we have a very coal dependent energy sector, and we do need to transition. And you can see the vastity of the coal use in the energy sector. In terms of the electricity sector, this shows you the different sources from 2010 to 2022 and how we've actually changed in the years, but not changed that much, still very coal dominated. In terms of the current electricity sector practices with the largest carbon footprint and intensity. So if we look at the energy sector, previous reports showed that about 46% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the electricity generation in the country. And this is in the industrial, commercial, and agricultural and transport and residential industries. And you can see the split of the electricity use within these different industries as at the 2021, and the pictures is highlighted on the screen. So just in terms of the electricity production, each kilowatt hour produces about 1 kilogram or kg of CO2. And this is basically the mix that we have of the different technologies. The future pathways. Yadashan has mentioned the Integrated Resource Plan of 2019, and that is the latest resource plan that we have. So basically, this plan aims to calculate or model the optimal generation mix based on specific assumptions, specific targets that will be put into the model. It does take into account the stability of the network, and it does take into account aspects relating to some of the transmission network, but not necessarily what entails within the transmission sector of generation. This specifically looks at generation technologies from a top-down approach more than in a bottom-up. And what we've seen and what we're currently seeing is that there's almost a two-prong approach in terms of you are getting generation in the distribution sector at this point, and at the generation points as well. So all of those aspects were taken into account, and in some ways, some technologies have been put out for the various years in terms of how to transition away from coal resources towards a more low carbon intensity system. But I think it's still required to be updated. And at this point, I think DMRE is actually undergoing that specific activity in terms of updating the IRP, because the assumptions that were put in were basically based on the data in 2019 or before 2019. But also note that in terms of the model, they try to optimize it for the least cost pathway, because we obviously do not want to have a generation mix that is too expensive for users to actually pay for, and have energy poverty in relation to that, and worsen the socioeconomic issues that we already have in the country. So the CSIR did do an exercise to model the least cost pathway for the electricity sector, and it looks slightly different. It is more renewables that can be put into the system, but I think a lot of developments have happened from that point, and I think the new IRP will paint a little bit of a different picture in my view. If we look at the energy sector, and I said, you know, electricity was 46% in the energy sector, we still need to reduce emissions within the energy sector, and more the hard to abate sectors and other sectors relating to energy. And here we have a pathway from NBI at this point, and I think even the CSIR is trying to project its own pathway and what that will look like in terms of the modeling that will be done. And these are the different technologies that are foreseen with the different capacities within the different years. And, you know, there's an option with gas, and there's an option with green hydrogen. But I think the costs will probably lead to a different picture, and the optimization and taking into consideration of the assumptions that need to be taken into account for the actual implementation of these technologies may paint a different picture. But this is the start, and this is what we have at this point. So the circular part and some of the circular economy interventions that have been put into the report. So as I've shown you in the previous picture, or pictures in the slide quite back, there's the two options: circular economy in the energy utilities and circular economy in energy materials. And in terms of the utilities, these are the options, and I think all of you are well aware of most of the options that are presented on the screen, mostly relating to renewable energy, and also relating to the technologies that are sometimes combined with renewable energy to give different technologies and options. I won't go into detail into these technologies and the options. The report does cover this, and you can refer to it there. In terms of other options in energy utilities, so hydrogen is a little bit of a big topic at this point as well, and specifically green hydrogen seems to be the silver bullet for everyone's problem in the whole world. But I think that there are different colors of hydrogen that can be looked into and investigated and evaluated for use of decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sectors. So one of the options in terms of use of green hydrogen, or a few of the options rather, you can use it to decarbonize the manufacture of steel, or make green steel and green iron. You can use it to decarbonize the agricultural sector with the manufacture of green ammonia and then green fertilizer. And there are various other options in terms of the hard-to-abate sectors. Even aviation fuel and bunkering fuel is also an option in terms of that. But obviously the price is too much at this point in time, but there are different policy changes and regulations that are being made in terms of providing incentives for moving towards this, because we do need it to reach net zero targets globally. In terms of other energy utility options, carbon capture, utilization, and storage has also been put forward, and this will definitely be required, especially given the fact that we will still have Medupi and Kusile running for the next 50 years. And because they've just started their life, and essentially we will want to ensure that we recover the economic life. And by that virtue, we will then need carbon capture, utilization, and storage. At this point in time, it's still quite expensive, but there are a lot of research that is being put into it to try and reduce the costs and try to find better solutions in terms of the use of this, and when we can actually see it within the sectors globally as well. The next option is energy efficiency, and here I think it's energy efficiency is seen as a small player, but can actually have a very big impact in terms of overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the implications in terms of us just moving towards a more circular economy in terms of reducing the actual waste for the specific sector, in terms of the electricity sector specifically, and transport and in industry. So these are the different options, and again, you can go into that a little bit more into the report and get more information. Other options that have been put out: freshwater substitution and desalination. I think Ash can speak to this more in his presentation, and we'll do that. But in relation to how it relates to the energy sector, because we're talking about hydrogen and green hydrogen specifically, and that requires water as part of the value chain, we can actually put forward these options to ensure that you can even target 2 bullets at one time, because you can oversize your desalination plant, and you can actually service the communities around, as well as use it for the actual green hydrogen production that has been mentioned. Then there's freshwater substitution, and I think Ash will also touch on that a little bit. There's clean coal technology, in terms of looking at different coal technologies and how to reduce the emissions from the current coal technology. Fly ash valorization, and using fly ash as byproducts within different industries, and making value add products. And then in terms of circular economy in energy materials, so here we are looking at trying to increase the longevity of the technologies, and ensure that recycling actually happens, and to increase the use of the specific materials and minerals that we would require in the specific energy sector and different technologies. So again, I think you can touch on or look at this in the report in the different options. In terms of the results, so we did do the survey as mentioned, and the 3 questions that we were asking was what circular economy interventions can benefit South Africa. South African economy, I think it's supposed to be, and the level of implementation of the interventions and the readiness to actually implement them. So these are the different technologies, and the survey answers are represented in the slides as well. And I think here I can just touch the top two options were energy storage and energy efficiency. And I think this is because most of the respondents could relate to those technologies and know more about that. I think there's also a little bit of a lack of understanding about how circular economy relates to specific options within and specific technologies within the energy sector. I think a lot of people don't know that we are already having circular economy options and interventions within the energy sector. And I think that type of knowledge sharing and technology transfer is still required to I think, highlight the opportunities that circular economy actually presents and why it's actually so important. In terms of the energy materials, these are the specific options and the appropriateness of the options. Again, you can go to the reports for more information. In terms of the readiness to implement, again, here, renewables and storage were the top two options in terms of the readiness to implement them. And in terms of level of implementation, again, it speaks to renewables and energy storage more. There were a lot of constraints that were highlighted and obstacles that were highlighted, and this information is available in the report. And we did touch on some of the aspects that need to be unpacked, especially from a policy perspective and some of the enabling environment perspective, and this is available in the report. In terms of business opportunities, so here I'll just touch on the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, and this provides a lot of opportunities in terms of identifying enterprise development opportunities as well as other larger businesses and implementation of such. So this highlights some of the funding that has been requested for. It hasn't been put forward, but I guess some of the money can come from the 8.5 billion that everyone knows about, the Just Energy Transition Partnership money. And here, I think what I wanted to highlight is that there were three aspects or three high-level aspects that have been identified for funding, and that is decarbonization of the electricity sector and the electricity grid, new energy vehicles, and green hydrogen. And significant amounts of budget has been requested for these specific sectors. And this offers a lot of business opportunities within the energy sector. In terms of other business opportunities, there's a lot of business opportunities in the energy efficiency sector, and this speaks to the SANEDI DMRE program that's currently running. And there's also opportunities in distributed generation, and this speaks to rooftop PV and embedded generation. And there's tax incentives that have been put out for rooftop PV or photovoltaic panels that will be bought within this year. And there's also opportunities in expanding the recycling market. I think we actually lack recycling facilities for e-waste, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to actually increase that potential. There's reindustrialization. I think you have been and will hear it in the public domain that the country wants to move towards reindustrialization and industrializing some sectors that we haven't done before. For instance, manufacture or assembly of rooftop PV panels and wind components, as well as some of the components that may be required in the green hydrogen value chain as well. There's opportunities for SMMEs within all of these sectors, because you will see that most of the policies that have been put out identify, SMMEs to be part of these value chains. So there's definite opportunity there. And SARM is the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan. There's a draft that's currently out, and that has highlighted a lot of opportunities in the whole renewable energy landscape and value chain. So that's it from me. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too much of this time.
Thank you so much, Aradhna. I think this is just a lot that we're trying to unpack, for which 1.5 hours is nothing, right? I think we can easily squeeze in one of those sectors in 1.5 hours. So the last speaker is Ash Setal. He will speak to the circular economy in the water sector. Ashwin Setal is a specialist in integrated water resource management within the CSIR Smart Places cluster. His businesses and technical acumen and capabilities were honed over a 40-year career in higher education, government, business, and research. As a multidisciplinary specialist with extensive strategic and operations experience in the water, natural resource, and development sectors, many aspects of his work have contributed to structural, policy, legislative, and implementation reform processes. He is passionate in system analysis and pragmatic strategic formulation, complemented by a proven ability to implement. So Ash, the floor is yours. The presentation is visible. Maybe just go into
okay. Yeah, thanks, Katrina. Like you said, you know, you have these glitches. What's it called? Murphy's Law, eh?
Absolutely.
Yeah, now suddenly my screen's doing all sorts of funny things. Just tell me if it's in presentation mode, please, when it does get in.
It's not a presentation mode yet.
All right, should be in.
Perfect.
Are we good to go? Right,
Yes.
lovely stuff. All right, so I see my two colleagues have thrown me under the bus here in two ways. I've got to answer a lot of questions. I rather now, you know, with the green hydrogen economy and what can be done there. And then secondly, from a time perspective, and for those of you who know me, I seldom ever finish on time. But given that it's now 16:13 and the session's meant to finish at 16:30, I have to do my best to try and cover a lot of things. So essentially, all I can ask you to do is fasten your seatbelts, and you're in for a very, very bumpy ride. So I'm going to move at breakneck speed. A nice thing is water flows through a lot of the sectors you've heard being spoken about. I think from your Darshan's presentation, contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, apart from wastewater treatment and some of the other sectors, is not as substantial as the energy sector, but the opportunities for, call it, working together with these sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to enhance the circular economy are quite substantial. So what you're going to get essentially from my, what's it, about 60 slides in 5 minutes is an imploded presentation. So essentially, here we go. And as Linda indicated earlier on in her introductory presentation, this is the hot off the press technical report that's been released. And let me acknowledge first and foremost my team. That's Matlodi. I'm not sure if she's in the house. Walter recently joined us, thrown into the deep end. Linda has been, had to really dig deep in terms of her forbearance in dealing with us and our approach to things. And last but not least, Henry. I think Henry is also in the house. He's been our project sponsor, reviewer, and ardent supporter of the water sector. And I think it's nice to have both Henry and Linda involved in here as well, given their involvement in aspects of the water sector as well. So moving on, just to give you a sense, it's a slightly different perspective. I'm not going to give you a research scientist presentation. You're going to get a practitioner's presentation. And if anything, you want to read what's in the report, go and have a look at the report, please. I'm not going through the entire report here. I'm going to give you some of the dirt that sits behind the report. Hopefully you enjoy that. But very quickly, just some thoughts on, well, not some thoughts, just to share with you the South African water sector snapshot. I've condensed a hell of a lot of stuff in one slide. But like I said, that first slide can actually take a week. You can spend a year basically discussing the various facets of the water sector. And the first two parts of my presentation also relate to the relevance and importance of the circular economy in South Africa. I will dwell very briefly on the project approach and design. And the reason I do that, it's the sector approach in the study, we did it slightly differently. And then I'll get on to the findings, conclusions, and outcomes. And like I said, you're getting what's not in the report in section 4, and then just some closing remarks, some thoughts on this. So here's the water sector snapshot. For those of you who don't know, here we are. We're a water scarce country, low rainfall, high evaporation. You can, oh, let me get my laser pointer out, sorry. Here's the slide. the picture on the left-hand side of the screen that actually shows the rainfall distribution that translates into the amount of runoff we have across the country. It's very uneven in time and space. A large proportion of our water resources, both groundwater and surface water, are shared resources with our international neighbors. So we are obliged to actually not use all the water in South Africa. Something many of you are probably aware of now is the poor water quality status in many of our raw water resources, particularly surface water resources. For those of you who've seen the green drop, blue drop reports that were recently released, that gives you an indication of where the problems lie that contribute to some of the poor water quality we have within our water resource systems in the country. The fifth point is that many of our big water systems are highly regulated. All that means is that they are managed, they are controlled. We have dams, what other countries would call reservoirs. We have canal systems, and we actually manage the flow in those systems. Last but not least, there's a very high competition as a water scarce country amongst the different water users in the country. So that's the bad news. That's the overall characteristics of our water resources. On the top of the slide, you'll actually see what our water uses are per sector. Agriculture is the biggest user, as is the case in many other countries, I think globally, but especially in developing countries. Our next biggest user is the municipal and domestic sector. You'll find that energy, while it may be a small user of water, it's what we call a strategic water user. So they have a very high assurance of supply requirement. That means we've got to make sure that the energy sector, particularly our power stations, have enough water to generate electricity. That's important to keep the economy going in the country. They're the only what we term a strategic water user in the country. Right. The bad news is that if we look at our demographic trends, which is what impacts on water demands, growth in the population figures, growth in human settlements, there's a decrease in the number of people per household, although there's a growth in the settlements. That's the only decrease we have. So basically saying that we have fewer people living in more homes. But because of the higher demands and the increasing call it lifestyle, so the improvement in lifestyles, there's a higher demand placed, there's a premium placed on having water on tap, as it were. And there you can see the number of households that the country is growing at. Right, we also projected to increase our water demands at least over the next few decades, and that's not good news for the country that's already stretched to the limit. Now, I've been a practitioner in the space for several decades. And over that period, I've seen a number of what we call lovely terms that come in here. More recent terms include the water, energy, food nexus. This is not the World Economic Forum, it's the water, energy, food nexus. We've spoken about integrated water resource management, water resources management, integrated catchment management. So the question is the circular economy relevant to the South African water sector? Or is it just another buzzword like all of the ones that have come and gone? Is it the new term for some of these same old practices, again, with little impact? A lot of money is thrown at these globally. But perhaps it may be a change in the paradigm. And if it's a change in the paradigm, does it relate to the extended resources availability? Are there economic benefits? Can there be financial gains? So let's look at what that means here. But I think ultimately, all of these fancy terms I've mentioned have a direct link to what I think not just South Africa, but many countries around the world look for, and it's called water security. So our focus, even with the circular economy, like I said, we may not be in the sector, I'm saying we use it very royally in terms of involvement in the circular economy paradigm. The circular economy has very strong possibilities in ensuring water security. We've had water for growth and development, like I said, the water, energy, food nexus, all of these things all relate to water security. And if you look at presentations recently made to Parliament, a lot of the strategic interventions included in that presentation relating to water security have a direct link to the circular economy. Right, so that's, if anything, the importance of the circular economy as part of what we found out of this study. But why is the circular economy important in the water sector. You've seen that in the first slide as well. Importantly, water is a natural resource. It's the only natural resource that is so critical to our existence. It's so critical, and that's our social existence. It's so critical to the environment, but critical also to our economy. It is fundamental to the lives and health of our people, stability of our society, and growth of our economy. That's quoted by our current sitting president back in 2021. All right, and if we run out of water, it will, without any shadow of doubt, constrain South Africa's future growth. It will have dire consequences, not just for the vulnerability of our economy, but for the stability of our social political situation in the country. Good news is that South Africa's water sector is not a stranger to the circular economy. It may not have been called a circular economy in the past, but a number of the circular economy interventions that you'll see me talk about here are covered in the legislation, in policies, in strategies and plans. So you can call a rose by any other name. So the circular economy is in many ways captured within the water sector. And I think if anything that comes out of what we've done in this current work is that South Africa must intensify its circular economy interventions, because that, if anything, will improve our resource security and ultimately mitigate any potential economic risks associated with it. Right, I'm going to whip through this. Linda's touched on this. This is actually what I'm presenting is phase 2 of the study. There was a phase 1 where we did have a policy briefing note that came out of this. But essentially, in embarking on this stage of the deep dive, as Linda called it, there were a couple of things that we actually felt was important in looking at the water sector considerations. And the first of these, that whatever we put out in this report had to be meaningful and representative of the South African water use sector views. Secondly, being good scientists, I'd like to think we're good scientists, it needed to provide some sound empirical basis to enable continuity with any of the proposed recommendations coming out of our report. All right, and we also had a look through the very detailed analysis of local and international lessons and best practice through, like I said, a very intensive literature survey out of this. Now, for those of you who know the sector well in the country, you'll know that it's a very diverse sector. It's extensive in many ways. Its scope extends from very social interventions to highly engineered and scientific areas as well. It's a very contested, very competitive environment. It is complex and different to many of the other sectors. So as a consequence, one of the key approach we followed here was to try and access as many views and insights as possible through an open process. And our survey was designed in that way. It was thrown open, essentially a shotgun approach. But what we didn't want to lose as well was the value coming through from so some of the key sectoral role players, agriculture, energy, etc. So we did get some generic insights from what we call the representative organizations or structures within some of these sectors. Right? So this approach was intended to maximize participation in the whole process of assessing the importance of the circular economy in the sector. And what we like to think is that what we have done now becomes part of a continuum to support the traction of a paradigm that enables water security through the circular economy. And last note is that the study is very much South Africa specific. All right, so given that, I think Aradhana has spoken about this. The approach that we used in terms of the methodology was threefold. How do we design out wastefulness and pollution, closing the loop, and regenerating natural resources? And to give you a bit of a shout out here, Kat, this is from Circular South Africa. Your 5 R's, I quite like your 5 principles there, where you say rethink the water system, reduce water consumption, use and reuse of waste and stormwater. It's actually using stormwater more, recycle water, especially in internal operations. That's the water use efficiency stuff, some of which Aradhana kind of spoke about as well, and replenish by returning water into the natural systems. Nice stuff. Okay. So amongst the project findings, The key points are in highlights below here. I'm not going to go through all of these slides. So you'll find if one looks at the various water use subsectors that we covered, the organizational categories that we dealt with, whether they're government, NGOs, private sector. We also looked at the years of experience in the subsector and some very interesting findings that came out. Like I said, this information that I'm presenting to you here is not in the report. And also we looked at what is your authority within the organization. So the findings out of that, many were highly experienced individuals who completed the survey. They're very knowledgeable professionals. Many are in senior positions, executive seniors there. They're in a wide range of public and private sector water use economic sectors. You can see that here. Furniture manufacturing, the financial sector, etc. So we've covered a wide spectrum of subsectors that either directly or indirectly impact on the water space. Amongst the, look, we had to give a lot of thought to the kind of circular economy interventions we proposed in the survey, but we didn't want to be too presumptive to say that we've covered all of these. So of the 9 main ones here, we threw the floor open for other suggestions. We actually got none. So it gave us some comfort in the fact that we did cover this. And when we asked the question of the respondents, tell us your familiarity with circular economy interventions, we actually had a very good and very even spread amongst the 9 interventions, proposed interventions that we put out. And there were no additional ones that were proposed by our respondents. Then if we look at the individual credentials, or the credentials of the individual respondents as well, their rating of their personal knowledge of the circular economy, their involvement in circular economy, activities, etc., and direct experience with circular economy projects, I must confess, we actually had very good feedback, a lot of involvement, a lot of their rating of knowledge being excellent to good, as you can see with the in these pie charts here. But interestingly enough, a lot of the experience is by folk who've been in the space for between 5 to 10 years or longer. So it's individuals who've been in the space, and I'm not just saying in the water sector, but have been involved in industry for a long time, that actually see the merit of the circular economy in the various industrial or sector operations. And that's very, very key. In fact, it flows through very nicely in looking at the sector benefits. And if you look at of the 9 interventions, 5 of those, actually the ones that I've indicated here with the green arrows, there was overall agreement with the 9 proposed circular economy interventions that they do have quite substantive sector benefits in terms of water security, both from a water quality and water quantity perspective, but importantly, in enabling inclusive growth and perhaps new jobs creation. Like I said, that kind of stuff you'll probably see coming out in the report.
Ash,
yes.
can I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah, 1 minute or 5 minutes?
Okay. 3 minutes. I give you 3 minutes.
Ah, that's a nice compromise. Thanks, Kat. I will. In fact, I'm almost at the end, as you can see there. So part of the sector benefits, and you can go and have a look at this, but most interesting out of this, as I mentioned about job creation, etc., and you'll find there's an overwhelming support for this. There were divided views on whether the South African water sector has a good understanding of what the circular economy is and its potential benefits. I think therein lies our conundrum from a policy and intervention perspective. But I'll leave it to you to judge and figure out how do we actually drive that. We've made some recommendations, but perhaps you have some other thoughts as well. Because if you look at that in relation to the sector state of readiness and levels of implementation, very good. There's lots of support for this. Interestingly enough, also with Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies, circular business models, these are all new kids on the block, and circular design. These are new things. Some of the standard practices that we've had in the sector for many decades, water conservation, water demand management, resources efficiency, etc., the standard ones have got good support there. But if you look at this, the level of implementation of the circular economy, the problem is very few of these have been implemented, hence the question marks here. But the potential and part implementation seems to be pretty rife. All right, as I wrap up, Kat, you can have a look at this. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I've lumped opportunities and obstacles together for the simple reason, quite often an obstacle does become an opportunity. Depends on your perspective and how you want to look at this. And you can see there's a basket of these here, which we've kind of packaged into 4 key areas of opportunities and obstacles. It's essentially support for circular economy, for the circular economy itself, and incentives for it. The issue of awareness, attitude, perceptions, and knowledge is very, very key, came out quite strongly. Integrated approaches, collaboration and partnerships, and especially when it comes to circular associations, that's where that comes in there. And resourcing and capacity is where I would think there's a future opportunity with it there. Anyway, just to get to the study conclusions, I think there are 2 main ones here, that clearly the circular economy mainstreaming prospects in the water sector is an enabler for water resource efficient economic growth part in the country. It's a driver for water resource security and has the potential for direct financial and economic benefits. And it's nice to see in the chat box, Thomas, I see you talking about things from Belgotech side. That's part of what you can realize even at an industrial level. It also resonates with the findings of our literature analysis that we did there as well. Some of the other things I tend to fiddle around with, a more subtle outcome from the study was that it transcended what I'll call a strict water sector bias. That means this circular economy report doesn't come strictly out of the water sector. It's a collaborative effort by all sector role players in the economy of South Africa. And I think it has an important, call it glue role, to enable what I'll call integration. And that would be that integrated management paradigm in mainstreaming the circular economy, I think is a key element that can underlie any policy interventions that need to happen. And that harmonizes nicely for any of you that have looked at the draft National Water Resources Strategy 3. While it doesn't mention the circular economy in so many words, a lot of the circular economy interventions are described there. So the circular economy, while it has an economic focus, not a water sector focus, has a water resource security outlook to it. Right, there you go. You can read that slide at your leisure, but just again, some final thoughts. Like I said earlier on, it's not the circular economy is not new to the water sector. We have a track record that dates back decades. It's the scale required for meaningful impact that's important. The key sectors in the water space that become important is, as you saw, in terms of the biggest water use sectors, it's agriculture and settlement. That's largely in the municipal space and the industrial space. The municipal sector covers both human settlements and industry. And again, some of the strategic interventions that are proposed is how do you decouple enhanced precision agriculture comes to mind here, enhanced agricultural production from water demand. And that is where precision agriculture has a very strong role to play. Aradhana and I were talking about agrivoltaics as well, and how that could match up with less water use and energy generation in both the energy-water nexus space. We need to decrease wastage and increase water use efficiency, industrial level, household level, those are the areas. Increase on-site wastewater treatment. Yadarsan spoke about these large scale centralized wastewater treatment plants. Maybe we need to drop the scale a bit and encourage more on-site, better grey water reuse and all of these other things, permaculture, etc. And key to all of this is strengthening the public-private sector partnerships. Government can't do this alone, and the private sector needs to come on board very, very strongly. My last slide, just some take-home messages. In order to achieve that kind of meaningful impact, both the public and private sectors, both the sectors need to invest in the replication of current successful initiatives, the localization of international best practices. That's where a lot of the work we did with the literature survey of international best practice that may be relevant to South Africa is that localization. And through RDI, research, development, and innovation, how can we identify new opportunities to all of that? I think for those of you who have watched my presentation before, this is probably a rehash over the last 2 months of a number of presentations I've done on a number of platforms, I always close with the statement, is that the circular economy is our no option solution. Wastewater is definitely in the water space our new gold, right? The circular economy is very much a future-looking, forward-focused intervention, and that mainstreaming of a water circular economy paradigm in South Africa is critical. Just a last kind of series of pictures I've got here. Anybody of you involved in transformation and change, and I've done quite a bit of this in the water space over the last 40 years, you ask who wants change, everybody's got their hands up. When you ask people, take an inside look, who wants to change, their hands disappear. Importantly, when you ask who wants to lead the change, everybody runs away. With that, Chair, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, Katerina.
Thank you so much, Ash. I think you actually closed off our webinar quite well. We don't have time left now for the Q&A session, but I saw that the speakers have actually answered quite a lot of the questions in the chat, so I really appreciate it. As I said, we will publish the recordings later on, as well as the recordings of the session and the presentation. And Linda, I'm going to hand over for a 1-minute close off, and then I will close off the session officially. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina. I think the strong messaging that came out for me in this afternoon's webinar, and I know it was a lot to try and pack into 90 minutes, is that there's an urgency to all of this. There's an urgency in terms of addressing climate change and finding climate mitigation solutions. There's an urgency to addressing energy and electricity insecurity in South Africa, and an urgency in decoupling South Africa's economic development from water consumption, given the ceiling that we're expected to reach quite soon around water consumption and water availability. And so I think, to echo some of the comments that I've seen in the chat box, is that while the CSIR and our National System of Innovation has a very strong role to play in evidencing this transition, it really is, I think, in the words of Chris, implementation, implementation, implementation. And so I think your little cartoon at the end there, Ash, was very timely in that, you know, we really, I think the evidence is quite clear that transitioning to a more circular economy is imperative in terms of South Africa's development path, and we need to look at scaling, and we need to look at spreading those solutions around the country. So from my side, I'd just like to say a very big thank you to my CSR colleagues, to Yadashan, to Aradhana, to Ash for the excellent work their teams have done in preparing these 3 reports, to Henry and colleagues from the Department of Science and Innovation who supported this project. And then finally, Katerina, to yourself, to Circular South Africa, and to the broader network, thank you so much for the opportunity to partner with you this afternoon and to share these findings. The reports are all publicly available, so please feel free to read through them, engage with the documents, but let's see how we turn what we've put in the reports into action for change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. I just want to echo your words. I think it's really about building collaboration and partnership and actually having everything implemented on the ground, but also convincing the right stakeholders to come on board. So I think we have a long way to go, but excitingly, there are a lot of people online that we see that are passionate about the circular economy, that want to learn more. So thank you so much to the audience, the brilliant speakers that we had today. I know I rushed some of you quite harsh to actually make those complex topics in a few minutes, actually. So I would really ask the audience to go back to the technical reports, to go back into the recording as well, if you want to learn more. And then just some last words from our side. Please follow Circular South Africa on LinkedIn. We will publish upcoming events in the South African space. We are currently also constructing our website, where we are trying to get a knowledge platform together so that we have all this documentation there around the circular economy in South Africa. And then our next webinar will happen as part of the World Resource Forum as a loudspeaker event, looking at the food system in South Africa, which will happen on Thursday next week. And Christo posted some links in the chat. And I also just want to thank my team. I'm not the only person at Circular South Africa. There are quite a few more people involved in this. So thanks, Christo and Mark, and obviously also Maria and Tashma. And yeah, with that, I would like to close off the webinar and wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.